Today, on the Dig In podcast, we step into one of the most fascinating stories in human history, the rise of monotheism. How did ancient people move from a world filled with many gods, divine councils, and competing pantheons to the bold claim that there is only one God? To help us explore this question, I'm joined by Dr. Michael Hundley. Dr. Hundley earned his Ph.D. from the University of Cambridge, completed postdoctoral research in Munich, and now teaches religious studies at the University of Memphis. He has taught at Georgetown, Syracuse, and several other universities, and is the author of 3 books with a 4th on the way. His research focuses on the intersection of the human and the divine in the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East, and his work has become an important voice in understanding how monotheism emerged. Get ready for a conversation that dives into ancient history, cultural transformation, and the faith that still shapes our world today. This is God Against the Gods, how monotheism was born. Let's dig in. Welcome back, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova with the Sound of Heaven Church. Excited to have my guest on, Dr. Michael Hundley. Dr. Hundley, thank you so much for taking some time out to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, looking forward very much so to this conversation. So I want to set the stage and talk about this concept of many gods in the ancient world. So when we open the Hebrew Bible, we're stepping into a world that already had a deep history of gods and goddesses. So what did the religious landscape of the ancient Near East look like before Israel, I guess would be the best question to start out with here.
Right. So actually, I'm going to go a little even broader than that. So like in terms of world religions and whatnot, pretty much everybody out there imagined multiple different gods. That was kind of the universal. And we assume that this idea of one God is normal, but it's actually not. It is an aberration, right? So it is something that develops in the 3 monotheistic traditions. So pretty much across the globe, you have multiple different gods. That's the normal. Usually you have the top of the hierarchy. There's a high god who's kind of like the CEO, sort of the president, often is like a one-stop shop. He can do everything, which makes him better. Usually he doesn't really, often he, not always a he, sometimes has a spouse, but usually is not a fighter, is more of an administrator or a judge. He creates, and then after that, he's in charge. And then beneath that, you usually have the major gods who usually have a cool power. Like you get to Baal in the Bible later, you know, he's the local storm god. They usually have one cool power that, and they're in charge, almost like the president and then the different cabinet members, they're in charge of Department of Education, whatever it is, they have their specialization. And then beneath that, you've got the minor gods, who are kind of like servants. They're not usually not that well known, and they're kind of like just the age of the support staff. And then you go more in the periphery, then you get like the wild gods. Sometimes monsters are gods, sometimes rivers, sometimes sun, diseases. So the stuff that's a little bit more wilder, for lack of a better word.
Sure. So how do these, I guess it's a hard question. How did these thoughts come into existence? Like, how is this just something that always was? Is this something that they hoped for? Or it's just like, hey, I see a sun, must be a god because I don't understand it.
Sure. That is a good question. And with a lot of what we're talking about here, we don't really know. You know, we weren't there. We have imperfect information. So we're just kind of conjecturing here a bit. But I think something called the cognitive science of religion helps here a little bit. And basically the idea is, so this is called hypersensitive agency detection device, fancy term, but basically means if I don't know if it's either a person or a living thing or, a force. So for example, I'm back in the Serengeti, I'm hunting, the grass rustles. Is it a lion or is it the wind? So chances are it's the wind or another animal that's not a predator, but I am predisposed to assume it's a lion. Or if you're at home or in someone's house, it's really creaking, you assume, oh, there's an intruder or something is going on. So kind of what they say is in the face of this, we tend to assume, if we don't know, is there an agent, is there an actor behind it? We tend to assume yes. even if it's less probable as a survival mechanism.
Gotcha.
So it is natural then when something, and then the more unlikely it is, the more we are likely to assume there's an agent behind.
Sure.
So, and then this goes, the next theory related to that is called the theory of mind. And the basic idea with that is that we tend to project our minds onto the world around us as a way of understanding things, right? So if I'm, and one example I use in class, like if there's a girl, how do you know if she's interested in you or not? She doesn't tell you. That's like fourth grade. What she does is there's various signals, and effectively what you're doing is you're reading her mind.
Right.
You are seeing her gestures, her actions, her thoughts, not her thoughts, but her words, and being able to project that outward. So, and we do the same thing with our animals. We assume they're little people. Even our phones we talk to like they're human. So assuming the theory of mind is this idea that not only is there an agent out there, but there's an agent out there that's like me. And it could be less complex than me or more complex than me. But anyway, I'm going to understand it in a human-like way because I can't help myself.
Right.
So I'm at the top of the food chain. And if I'm imagining gods, they have to be better versions of me because that's all there is. And also, there's a practical side of that too. If they're like me, then I can actually influence them.
Gotcha.
So this gets to the question of like, why would you believe in a rain god in particular, right? So today, like you read the Bible, it mentions God as a rain god a ton, but nobody's really praying for that aspect of God anymore. Because what we usually do is we go to God for our particular felt needs, the things we can't meet for ourselves. So in the ancient world, you have the option of believing that the rain just happens. It's a product of natural phenomena that I have no control over whatsoever. Or there is a being in charge of it who is like me. And that one is a lot more comforting, to believe that someone in charge of it is like me. And if they're not like me, I can't relate to them, so that doesn't really help. But if they're like me, then they want the same things I want.
Right. And
I can serve them. I can worship them. People like to be pampered. And in return, I get the rain and they get followers. So, yeah. And I think also, and the more like, so something that the question of like, for example, the universe, right? So the more unlikely it is like that, it's much more natural the way we think growing up. We're not born thinking scientifically. We're born believing in imaginary beings, whether they're real or not. So the idea, the more unlikely it is, the more likely we are to assume that there is an agent behind it, a creator who is like me. So it seems to be kind of fundamentally built into our DNA.
Right. And so like the instance, like the rain, if you pray for rain and then it just happens to rain, it kind of reinforces the idea, oh, see, this is what God wants.
Absolutely. And if it doesn't rain, then I must have done something wrong and the God is mad at me.
Right.
So I got to redouble my efforts, or maybe I'm praying to the wrong God. So the stakes are high enough that I'm going to believe it no matter what. And either if it works, then great, I did my job. If it doesn't work, then I must have done something wrong. Because if the system doesn't work, then I'm screwed. Because if it doesn't rain, then I don't live. So the idea of having a being out there above me who's in charge of it that I can relate to is really hard to get rid of.
Gotcha.
In the face of all types of positive reinforcement, like, nope, I still believe it. It must have been ritual failure or fill in the blanks. I didn't do my dance nice enough.
So Dr. Hundley's not going to do the dance for us today for the rain.
No, no dances. No.
So coming back to the ancient Israelites' view of their divine God, comparing to their neighbors, was it radically different, or was it more similar than what people may think?
Yeah. So, and again, we're conjecturing here, looking at the text, which gives us, it's so to say. I can't do a time machine and jump back and be like, oh, here it is. And if I did, I probably wouldn't understand them.
Right. Right.
But I think this is something that a lot of people don't understand, so people often assume that like the Bible just sort of fell out of the sky in the King James English or something like that, right? And it was written in a context with people who understood the world the way their neighbors did. And in the Bible itself, they mention the word God multiple hundreds of times. And they almost never say other gods don't exist. What they're trying to say generally is you don't need them because I'm enough. So, and they're like, even in the context of Genesis and Exodus, you say like, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If they believed he was the only God, they wouldn't need to specify. All right. So like, he's our God, and then there's other gods out there. And you tend to have, so in that particular area, you tend to have high god El, who is the high god of Ugarit. This basically, if you're looking at Cyprus, the little finger pointing at the mainland, that's where Ugarit is. So that was written before the Bible got written, but this El guy was the high god, and then you had major gods under that, and then minor gods below that. So the biblical world is very much like that. And from what we can gather here, and here we're talking about perceptions, not necessarily reality, because in religious studies, I can't tell you whether God's real or not. I can tell you what people thought about God.
Sure.
And their thoughts generally were, it seems to be that they thought this was our God, and there is a local, and there's a high God, and then there's also a bunch of other gods beneath that. So, for example, the word son of God, people will often interpret that in a different way, but and Ugarit, a son of God, is just means God, right? So Ezekiel gets called son of man, which simply means he's a man.
Right.
And you have this idea that the host of heaven, the divine council, even cherubim, seraphim, so many different characters. And angels, we assume, are not gods, usually because we assume there's only one God, which is kind of, we're kind of assuming our solution before we even look at it. But by the standards of the ancient world, a lot of these beings probably were gods. So this is something that's a little tricky, because other languages, Akkadian, which is a language of ancient Mesopotamia, and Egyptian, they have something called the determinative, which is a fancy way basically of saying that by the word, it'll tell you what kind of thing it is. So, you'll have a word and we're like, what is this? It'll say river. It'll say mountain. It'll say person. It'll say animal. And the determinative there's a determinative for God, right? So you have that in the ancient world. And that's one of the main reasons why we know what they thought gods were. Right. Because they explicitly label them gods. Bible doesn't really have that. So the Bible, there is no determinative. And when we're reading it through this modern lens, reading back onto it. And because it doesn't explicitly call them gods, we often assume that they're not. But chances are, based on all the parallels we know, the ancient people would have imagined the world, even the world that they believed in, full of multiple different gods.
So would we define God or a deity of some sort, just anything that's outside of our natural realm, flesh? Like, because I've thought this before. I wondered this before. Like you mentioned angels, right? You mentioned cherubim. You mentioned the divine. I have a question on the divine council in a second, but you mentioned these things. So the belief is, especially modern Christianity today, like I said, I'm a pastor, right? Most hold this stance. I believe in there's one true God. There's one God, right? And so forth and so on. So the thought is, well, we're not a polytheistic religion, but yet right. At the same time, when I take this back or ask questions around the Old Testament, I go, well, when you believe in these different divine beings, anything outside of our, again, I don't even know how to word it right, outside of our flesh, outside of our realm, outside of our world, wouldn't those be considered kind of deities of some sort?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of it's a matter of labeling. So, and I think this is something we'll probably get to, but the idea that moving to this monotheistic idea wasn't really changing the way they thought, but changing the way they labeled the world in a lot of ways.
Oh, interesting.
So at this point, you don't really have, deity or God really are pretty much synonyms. So they didn't have that many words for it. So in their mind, saying this is a God was kind of like pretty normal. And they didn't define it exactly. So more often than not, we don't define what a person is. We just label, that's a person, this is this. These are just things in their environment that they consider to be gods. They weren't sitting there philosophizing and saying, well, this has the necessary qualities and that doesn't. Right. I think that's a god. I think that's a god. And I think there's a bunch of other beings that are sort of in between. So for example, you'll have like in ancient Mesopotamia, you'll have like a river. Is it a god? Well, it depends on the text. So it's always a river, but sometimes it's a god and sometimes it's not. And it depends on the context, right? So I think more often than not, something becomes a god when I need it to be a god. So when I need it to have agency, when that helps me to understand or engage with my world, then I assume it's a God. Like you can make an instrument a God when I need that instrument to pacify an angry God who's going to kill me otherwise. So it's one of those terms like a fuzzy label, similar. And this is actually my new book project is about gods and monsters. Like monster as well. There's no DNA test for God or monster. It is a label that we put to things. And I think from all that we know, it seems like a label that people would have used, right? So in the context of ancient Israel, right, you have this idea that you need to put away your foreign gods if you're going to worship this Yahweh character.
Right.
And it's not saying these gods don't exist, but it's just saying you need to be exclusive. So
God wants
in their mind,
God wants.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was say God wants the commitment. He wants the
yeah. Right. And that's this idea of monolatry, which for them, I think, for me, it's not a great way to define it. So some people use the word henotheism, which is one God, from the Greek. That one, it's a little bit fuzzier for me. I like monolatry better, but again, we're using these terms that only sort of apply. So monolatry, mono means one. Latria is Greek for worship, so singular worship. And the way I explain this to my students basically is it's like a marriage, right? So I recognize the existence of other women out there. I'm not saying they don't exist. What I am saying, though, is I have this exclusive commitment to my wife, so she's the only woman for me. And that pretty much is the direction the Bible goes. And this is the thing, more than anything else, that sets them apart from everybody else. It's not that denying the existence of other gods. In fact, even today, there isn't a single monotheistic tradition. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all believe in multiple supernatural beings. Why don't we call them gods? And that is largely a question of how we chose to label things.
Interesting. Very. And it is fascinating to try, like you said, we can't jump in a time machine, go back and go, wow, this is incredible. We're having conversation just to try to put ourselves back into the mindset and the view of how these people were viewing. It's even mentioned in the rivers. It's very fascinating. It's like, oh, yep, it's a God today. But I have to pull back on the divine council for a second here. Can you explain the concept of the divine council, what it was, and how it helps us understand what the early Israelite religion was or thought process was around this?
Mm-hmm. So you have this concept pretty much across cultures, but throughout the ancient Near East, also ancient Greece, and you go further afield. The idea there, like I talked about the hierarchy, you have a high god. And just like humans, when they're making a decision, they meet. And the high god at the end of the day is the one who makes the decision and decides this is what we're going to do, but they take counsel. Right, and the divine council is there, so at minimum, they seem to be just a group that meets with God and a sounding board. They are subordinate to God in the sense that he's the high god, so they do what he says. But it just seems like a group of other beings that we might call gods who serve him in some function. And just like the president's going to make a big decision, he gets the cabinet together, they hash it out.
Right,
that's the divine council.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a very interesting. I've heard many teachings on the divine council,
right?
And it's always an interesting spin on some pretty some wild some things as well too.
Yeah, there's a lot of crazy stuff in there.
Yeah, there is. There certainly is. But yeah, awesome. Appreciate that. All right, so let's take this and go to the shifting of the polytheistic idea to this monotheistic idea, and as I know we briefly spoke about already, some scholars debate whether Israel was truly monotheistic from the beginning. And I think you answered this kind of with labels, but was Israel's faith always centered on one God, or did this evolve over time?
Right. So when we talk about Israel itself, it's hard to say because what we have access to is their texts. So was Israel always this way? Archaeological evidence suggests not. Even the texts say, the whole time it's saying, oh, you're worshiping all the wrong gods. So, but according to the main narrative in the text, exclusive worship was there, is the driving force in the text, right? But I think here, this idea of monotheism, I think, even in some ways you could argue that, so for example, in the New Testament, they call Satan the god of this world. So what does that mean? Is he a god? Is he not a god? So in my mind, I think monotheism is a concept, was developed, 1660, the word, and then we retroject it back on. So the way I see monotheism, or for me, the monolatry thing, right? So other cultures, you typically have, so there's one story called Enuma Elish, which is really famous, this Babylonian story. Usually call it the creation story, but it's not really about creation. But basically, you have this Marduk character who kind of was the god of nowhere. Like Babylon was like a backwater. And then effectively, Hammurabi conquers the world. So the king of nowhere becomes the king of the world. And then you got to rebrand the god. The god can't just be this nobody god. So the story there is designed to rebrand Marduk as king of the gods. And one of the main ways they do that is sort of like, I use the analogy of Amazon.com. So you don't deny the existence of other gods. You don't say you can't shop with those other stores. What you basically say is, I'm the one-stop shop god. I'm supreme because, he doesn't invent any new powers. He's not saying other gods don't exist. They don't, you're not saying even worship me. What he is saying is, I can do in one place all the things the other gods can do corporately.
Gotcha.
And that makes me best. And then he's arguing to be king of the gods. The Bible is interesting and different, right? So for the most part, what he's arguing for is not to be king of the gods. When he's talking to the nations, he says, I want them to know who I am. When he's talking to his people, it says, if you're going to have me your God, it's got to be exclusive. So actually, exclusivity, though, probably is a harder sell. So like, say, for example, king of the gods, if I have no ability to control childbirth, I'm still good enough to be king of the gods. But if I want exclusive worship, I have to be able to do absolutely everything. Because if I can't deal with childbirth, then you're going to go to the goddess of childbirth when that comes up.
Sure.
Right. So from the very beginning, if you are defending exclusive worship, this God has to offer absolutely everything. And if there's anything he doesn't offer, you're going to go shop elsewhere. So this is one of the reasons why Baal in particular is a threat, because he's a local storm god. And you're coming to this land, you need rain. He's a local guy. Yeah, we worship Yahweh, but why not go to him too?
Sure.
And this is something, again, that's not natural. We assume religion is exclusive, right? So I'm either this or I'm that. But in most of the world, and most of the ancient world, why would I do that, right? So for example, like if my favorite grocery store is Whole Foods, it's not like I'm going to, Whole Foods doesn't carry what I'm looking for. It's not, I guess I'll give up. I'm going to go to another store. And that is typically how we do religion too. So you have this, on the one hand, you got to argue that this God can do absolutely everything. And the way the text presents him is also very interesting because he doesn't really have a backstory. So whatever might have been there as a backstory is largely erased. And as a result of that, he kind of just is. And so he's unknown, which makes him pure potential. So he can be whatever the text needs him to be. Right. And kind of an analogy I use here too is like, if you grew up next to somebody, you know where they came from, then you have a good picture of who they are. And in order for them to change, they have to kind of rewrite the narrative. But if a new kid shows up, they're much more interesting because you don't know anything about them yet. And they could be anything.
Right.
And the way the Bible presents it presents God in that light where God can be anything the text needs him to be. So that's step one, right? So step one is this God's got to be everything. Because if he's not, no one's going to buy monolatry.
Right.
Step two is, well, why be exclusive? And then this is where you kind of put in a non-compete clause, if we're going to use the economic language, right? So basically saying, if you want me to be your God, it's got to be only me. So you got to pick me or the field, which is basically like, imagine Amazon saying, if you want to shop at Amazon, you got to not shop anywhere else.
Right.
I might be tempted to do that. They are incredibly useful. And that's kind of what's going on here, right? So God is saying that I got everything. So I am better in one place than all these other gods combined. And if you want what I have, you need to come to me. And then step three is competition, right? Where you're pushing the other gods out of the market, like Baal, for example. So effectively in the Israelite worldview, there is no room for other major gods. They're competition. Not in the sense that, God's worried about who's supreme, but they're competition for worship. So this is something I think biblically, it's different in a lot of other religions. There is no conflict on the cosmic scale. So God's in charge. God's always going to be in charge. The conflict is over us. So, and Baal is competition, not with God for supremacy, but with us for exclusive commitment, right? So you spend a ton of time pushing him out of the market and saying, like the Mount Carmel, making fun of him, like he's nothing, he doesn't have any powers. But they never actually say he's not a god. They're just basically saying he's nothing compared to me.
Right.
And so basically then you effectively are cornering the market, you have a monopoly, and you're basically, if you want Yahweh, then you got to be exclusive.
So this would also probably add to a lot. Again, I want to definitely stay on Israel, but I'm just thinking about even in the New Testament where you have Caesar asking the hey, listen, offer, light and incense for Caesar, their just absolute refusal must have been in the natural sense, right? Obviously from the religious sense, you're like, I'm taking a moral stand. So I understand from that, but from their perspective, like, you guys are so annoying because if you just did this would alleviate the headache for me.
Right. And that's something we'll probably get into soon. But even today, like a lot of other religious traditions, it's like, well, I'll go to your church and do your thing, but you don't come to mine. What's wrong with you? Because it's kind of normal that we share. But this idea of exclusivity really is separate. And I think most people who aren't born into it don't understand it. And I think in the context of Rome, it's offensive, right? So they called early Christians atheists.
Right.
Not because they didn't believe in God, but because they rejected the gods that everyone else believed in. And it's like, you guys think you're so special. Why won't you just bend the knee? Everyone else does it. You're not a god. You can worship your God, but worship ours too. That's just how society works.
Yeah. Making the same. It brings a lot more to that. All right. Going back to ancient Israel for a second, what role do you think that wars, exile, political upheaval played in shaping their understanding of God as well?
A lot. So can I go back? Actually, I wanted to add one more thing first. Right. So, so you have no room for major gods, but you do have minor gods, right? So, you do have sons of gods. You do have, and in my mind, you can argue, I think angels probably would qualify, gods plural, the divine council, the host of heaven, the holy ones, cherubim, seraphim. More than likely, you put them in the God category. And one thing the text does is interesting. So, and it has the benefit where you keep them around to kind of have an entourage. They don't really have much of a function. Sometimes the ones that had a function then become cheerleaders, basically as a way of hyping up the big guy.
Hey.
And sometimes they'll, like, so Sodom and Gomorrah, you have an angel go, you don't have God himself go. So it's a way of having some critical distance, various things like that. They also make sure it's not a threat. And this is something that only happens at the very end of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. Angels don't get names. These beings don't have any names. All they basically wear the Yahweh.com name tag. So it's like, I work for Yahweh.com and I'm an angel, literally is a messenger. And I'm this and I'm that. So there is nothing about them that we know that we can grab a hold of. They are basically just a conduit to their employer. And so the next step, and I think I'm getting to your question in a bit of a roundabout way.
This is great. Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
The next step they do is they decide to name this category. And this is something that happens actually, it's unclear exactly when, in Daniel 3, I think 24 and 28. It's when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in the lion's den, and they're saying, there's 4 men in there, these 3 guys,
in the furnace,
and one
right?
that looks like a son of God. And then later it says, and God sent his angel or messenger, right? So in that case, it seems like that's the first instance where we have people starting to call this bottom group angels. So effectively what you end up doing is you give this minor god category a name, and that name is angel. So there's no, and we're still talking about the market here, right? So in the Israelite market, you have the gods you're allowed to worship. Actually, you can't worship the little guys, but you acknowledge them, right? So in the system that's acceptable, you have God and angels, which effectively means you have only one God. So basically redefining this bottom category and pushing out the middle category is where, in my mind, this whole monotheism thing built. And if we want to get to it too, we can talk about where the foreign gods and all that come in a bit later.
So real quick on this, so would there be a difference then for the angels that were named, like Michael, Gabriel, things like that? Do you think there's a special reason why they're being named?
Absolutely. So, so basically the bottom category is called messenger. And most of them aren't messengers anymore, but they get classified that way. And then we read back into the text, and anything that happened that's not God, it must be an angel. And so why do angels get names and identities? And you look in the Bible itself, but then early Christian literature, there's all types of stories about these wild stories about angels. They're not competition anymore. So they're not God anymore. Now we've established that in the system there's only one God. And as a result of that, you can have some critical distance. You can give them names and identities. You can relate to them, but they're no longer competition. So once you've redefined the category, then you don't have to be careful. Yeah. So should I go back to the wars and all that stuff?
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is also something about the Bible that's really interesting, because usually you hear that history is written by the winners, but this is written by the losers. So throughout their history, except for a very, very brief period, they lost over and over and over and over and over again. And when they're competing against their local polities, like competing against, Moab or Edom or whoever, it's on a small scale. But when they get coming to the face of empire, it is a much, much different, right? So you have early encounters with Egypt, but especially things change when you have Assyria and Babylon, the two Mesopotamian powers. So Assyria does basically knock out the northern kingdom and turn Jerusalem pretty much into this one little surviving hill. The Babylonians send them into exile. So what happens is Israel gets weaker and weaker, and they can't do much. And as a result of that, in order to justify exclusive worship, God has to be stronger and stronger. So the weaker Israel gets, the stronger God has to be. And especially in the face of these universal gods, like we talked about Marduk, or ancient Egyptian Amun, or Assyrian Ashur. These guys are gods of empires. They're the one-stop shop God. And in order to justify exclusive worship, you have to convince people that Yahweh is still worth worshiping exclusively. So he takes on this universal role where he is bigger and better than they are. And this is something I think that happens in some of these stories. You are, like a lot of stories about gods is about saying, my God is better than your God, kind of a thing. And a lot of the biblical story is written just to justify why this God is supreme, even though it doesn't seem like it. So you kind of have to argue like, okay, well, on the face of it, and this is what, the Babylon and Assyria basically say is, your God's weaker than mine. How do I know? I beat you. So why would you still worship that God? And what happens in history is most times once you're conquered, at least after a while, you assimilate. And from the ancient world, this is really the only living religion left. And it didn't assimilate. So that's kind of one of these questions, why not? So of course you have the spiritual church answer, which may or may not be true, but that's not, as a scholar, I can't really go with that. And a lot of what I think is interesting is the arguments they make are incredibly compelling. That they explain why they lost, right? So we lost, and also this is something about this whole idea of monolatry that is interesting too, is in this context, this is where, and actually, can I just backtrack and do yeah, all right.
Absolutely.
Because it makes more sense if I explain it that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right. Great.
So, and then, in the system, you've got high gods, nothing in the middle. And then you had minor gods turned angels, so only one God. And then you still have the foreign gods out here, out to the side. So what do you do with them? Effectively, what happens is in the system, and this is where it finally does become monotheism. In the system, you got to identify them. Like where do they fall? So they get called demons. So pretty much, if it's a god if it's a being who's not on Team God, then it is a demon, right? So today, any god who is not the God is either a demon, not real, or a distortion of the one true God. It's kind of how people often will present it. So they get called demons. But then where do they come from, right? Are they independent of God? And then the early Christians say, no, they're not. God is in charge. God created everything, so God must have created them. So then what do we call them? Then what usually happens is, well, maybe God made them evil, or they chose to rebel. So the answer is they chose to rebel. And then what category are they in? The only category left is angel. So they become a fallen angel. And that is kind of how we explain what happened, right? So once you have, and then the demons are not fighting against, so Satan not fighting against God for supremacy. They're basically fighting the good angels over us. So in that system, basically you have this idea that, and by the way, this whole other supernatural evil thing is not really in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible very much, or not explicitly. That happens after that.
You're talking about Satan, right? Or the devil.
Satan, right?
Yeah.
So Satan still effectively seems to work for God in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, which is a whole nother topic if we want to get into that. But and all the characters that are a little bit sketchy are still working for God. So effectively in this system, there's only one supernatural power. And what that means is everything that happens is his responsibility. So either he allows it or causes it. And this is something that changes religion because now, where before the problem of evil isn't really a problem, because you got one God doing one thing, one God doing another. And here you have to explain, how does this one God of the universe allow all this stuff to happen? Right. And then this explanation where they go from here, well, so they spend a ton of time morally justifying God, and it's not his fault. And in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, where you don't have these other evil supernatural forces, the blame then falls on us. So what went wrong is we were not true to the covenant. We didn't follow our end of it, and God is punishing us for that. So you got to convince people that this happened not because our God is weaker, but because our God is punishing us.
Right.
And then step two is you got to convince people that punishment isn't the end, that there's some sort of redemption.
Right.
And that, kind of this idea that the suffering is going to be worth it. Right. So in the Jewish tradition, you have this idea of redemptive suffering, the suffering of the people. If we as a people suffer enough, then it'll bring about something like the Messianic age or something great. Christianity interprets it as suffering of an individual, of God, for the group. But the idea that, and you end up, when you have no hope in the future, in the present, when you are under the thumb of a bigger empire, you tend to project your hope into the future.
Sure.
And God makes bigger and bigger promises in order to keep the worship going. And it's kind of this question is, how are they going to then be realized? And this is really where Judaism and Christianity differ. Actually, Islam too. At that point, they both agree that God is making these great promises. We're weak. We're not realizing it. What went wrong is we screwed up. The question then is, where does redemption come from? And that is where those, all three of them kind of split up a bit.
Do you think it's just because the question would be, well, it's to get more followers. I think you made a statement like that in a little bit ago. What's the benefit? Is it just really a genuine search for truth, something to hang on to because the present day is so bad? So we're just trying to find something to give us light and hope due to what we're currently going through?
The benefit of what?
So like if we say like, hey, we got to get more followers. So we got to somehow come up with answers or reasons of why this does happen or doesn't happen. Like we pray for rain, it rained. Look, everybody, my God answered by rain. Come join me, right? Yeah. So is the benefit specifically selfish? Is it hopefulness? Is it like, oh yeah, I want rain? So when we talk about the split, or before we talk about the split of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, is it just that? Is it a genuine search for truth or self-benefit?
Yeah. So I think generally as humans, we're interested more in coherence than we are in truth. So for example, if I'm going to argue with you, chances are you're more likely to defend your own position than to think about my arguments. Right. So one thing that religion does is it brings coherence to our world. The world's big, the world's scary, and religion helps to explain it. And for the most part, it's not a numbers game, and it really hasn't been a numbers game. So for the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, the goal is there's not really any evangelism going on.
Right.
The idea here is and even in the case of Jesus, like the parables, he spoke in coded language. And basically as a way, it's almost like a weeding out device, right? So the goal is always this idea that you are supposed to be this people who, kind of the drama is you got a God who wants to be with people, but the people suck.
Right.
So how does that work?
Right.
And that is kind of the goal of it. It's not, we want to get as many people in as possible. We want to, have this really cool sales pitch and everything else. But the idea is we want the people who are there to understand what is going on, and we want them to be transformed. So the goal is depth, not so basically quality over quantity.
Gotcha.
And that is true in most of these cases. So the idea of getting as many people to worship as possible really wasn't a goal of actually, and this is true of most world religions. Most world religions don't actually evangelize.
Right.
So I think the whole numbers game thing, I think, really starts, especially once you get into empire, and then it's also a very modern phenomenon. But you don't really see much at all about that in either a Hebrew Bible or the New Testament.
So I guess the evangelism, where we see, I guess, the start of it, at least, that go into the world and preach the gospel to all nations aspect of things, was again a very foreign concept amongst the other most people. I'm assuming in the first century really didn't care really what anybody else believed per se.
You can believe whatever you want, right? I mean, so that it's very much like today in a sense where you believe you can believe your eyebrows are God. You can believe most everybody believed in gods, right? But the idea, again, it's this thing where I got my gods, you got your gods. So what do I need your gods for?
Right.
And then oftentimes gods were cultural. So like, for example, the God of Israel is the God of Israel. I'm not Israelite, so not my God.
Yeah.
And then the idea that, and this is, I think, where this whole idea of monotheism in particular changes the game, is when you have monotheism, you have this claim of absolute, right? So this is the God, and this one God does have all of the answers. And when that happens, you have to spread it, right? So the Jewish understanding was, or initially, that we are like, so in Genesis 12, we're going to be a blessing to the nations. The idea is we're going to be this great people, and who's going to show off our great God, and people are going to come to us. New Testament changes that and says, no, we're going to go to them.
Yeah.
But why? Most other world religions have no interest in that. So the three really that do evangelize, you have Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. And all three of them believe that they have the answer to the question, right? So they believe they have exclusive truth. And that is why they feel like they need to get more numbers. It's not like, hey, we're trying to build this evil empire and twist our mustache.
Yeah, right.
It's like the little old lady wants to save you so you can join her team and not and get the benefits and not the punishment.
Yeah. No, definitely. So do you think this move toward monotheism was more about theology or about survival and, I guess, cultural identity in the face of oppression? Like, do you think they were like, yeah, this seems like the absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in.
Yeah.
Or I hope this is the truth. You guys seem to be winning. I need to survive.
Right. No, so I think, and again, the idea of truth, I think to them, this made sense. So this is what allowed them, they didn't want to give up their religion. And basically this, for them, this is how they were able to have it cohere and to have them doing it, right? It's not just, survival, like, I'm trying to, I'm going to come up with something, like dirty and underhanded as a way of tricking people into believing this silly thing.
Right. Yeah. Right.
We believe all types of stuff. And I think in this case, like, whether it's true or not is a different question. But I think what makes it so powerful is they pitched it in a way that people wanted it. So it basically hit them where they wanted to hear it, what they wanted to hear.
Gotcha.
And this is why it still resonates. Like reading the Psalms. The Psalms aren't written to us, but they still resonate with us because they deal with the same human struggles and they offer us the same solutions to them. So one thing about this, exactly, where it's coming from, it is whatever. To me, that's a question I can't really answer. But for me, what it does that's so effective is it really speaks to the human condition in a way that goes across ages and times. So it did resonate with them enough because they survived, and it resonates with us because we're still talking about it.
Right. So were you convinced, I guess, again, we're playing the game here. When I say convinced, not 100% banging on the drum here, but if we went back to that first century and we're talking to the Pharisees or the high priests, their thought process was these other gods exist, but my God is the greater God? Or were they specifically, we are the only real, even the Jews, not the Christians, the high priests in the Jewish temples?
Right. We don't have any literature that says they said it was the only God, really, or not anything early exactly. So there is later literature that does say that, but around the time of Jesus, we have very, very little. And a lot of it is coming from like Qumran, so how much should we trust of that? But the idea of only one God didn't seem to be, it's hard to say again because we're talking about arguments from silence here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah.
So, but if I were to guess, I would say they probably acknowledge the existence of other gods, but they assumed that theirs was superior and theirs was worth worshiping exclusively. That didn't necessarily translate into saying other people should worship our God. It's just we're the chosen people. We got the best God. And then generally the way it would work is, and this is also something that's different with New Testament Christianity, if you want to worship my God, you got to become one of my people. So you become a Jew first. And this is one of the arguments between Peter and Paul. Yeah, do you have to follow the Jewish law? Do you have to become Jewish to become a Christian, or can you just jump the line?
Right.
So in their mind, it was like, we got the best God. Is he the only one? Well, it doesn't spell it out, but whatever is out there is inferior and it's not really worth talking about. But my God's great, and I'm going to show him off, and people can come to me and become and have what I have, but I'm not going to go out and advertise.
Yeah, it almost seemed like it was offensive to the Jews for the Gentiles, the non-Jews, to be worshiping the same God. They were almost like, wait a second, we're his chosen people. You have to become a Jew first. You can't jump ahead of me. And so again, it seems like it was an offensive statement to make, or an evangelizing in that type of way.
Right. So I think this is also what Paul talks a lot about. So the idea here is you don't have a big problem with them becoming Jews. So they can adopt my tradition. They can, even today, you convert to Judaism, you become part of the people. So for that wasn't a problem. But the idea is you can get rid of all of this stuff that the law and all this other stuff, and all that makes us Jewish and makes us special. These guys can just go and get in with nothing, right? That is kind of crazy.
Yeah, yeah.
It's offensive, yeah, but yeah, just the idea, like, how does that work? We have been surviving as this people. We've been faithful as much as we can. We're still here, and these other guys who don't know anything at all don't have to understand our suffering, don't have to follow our culture, and they can just jump up to the line and get Jesus to give them all these great things.
Right.
Not fair.
Right. So I have two more questions here. And if there's something that I missed that you're like, wait, we need to talk on this topic, feel free, for sure. I just want to be respectful of the time here with you. So how has this transformation or thought process, especially going from what we're defining as monotheism, understanding your definition, how has this shaped the way the world thinks about faith, morality, identity today?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of faith, I think it's interesting because, again, I mentioned before this idea of exclusivity. The idea is that in today, or if you go to China, you're kind of all of them. Yeah. Why would I differentiate? This idea that I am either a Christian or I am something else. And with that too, with the morality too, you also have this concept, and you get this in Buddhism somewhat, in Islam, this idea that there is a universal morality. That instead of you having your cultural customs and me having mine, and there being some sort of philosophical greater good, there is a divinely given set of rules that applies to everybody. And that's a game changer, right? So the way, and in our culture too, I mean, the Western world, but the U.S., so whether you're Christian or not, growing up here, you grew up in a world that was imbued with these Western Christian ideas. So like, even if you're anti-God, you're usually anti-God because he's not like what people say the Christian God should be. Right. So we tend to define everything through that lens. And then it definitely evolves. But like, even in terms of faith to beginning, so in the Western world, a lot of scientific advances come because people believed there was a God in charge and there was an ordered world. So with that, this gives definitive answers that other traditions don't.
Sure.
And then as a result of that, it often doesn't always play well with others.
Right. Yeah. So last question now, and speaking of my audience, and I love this conversation because it really opens up the box, for sure. If you could clear up one modern misconception about ancient Israel's faith, what would it be?
I think, it's kind of what we've been talking about. So for me, not monotheism, monolatry, exclusive worship. That is, so if you're looking at what sets Israel apart from everybody else, exclusive worship. You do have other cultures where you make a covenant, a contract between people and other people. And then the gods are sort of included in that. But the idea of this God making a contract with his people for exclusivity, that's the game changer. And in my mind, monotheism wasn't the goal, but was sort of an effect of having to promote monolatry. And I think also related to that question, I think people are often get away from is, why does it matter? Why does it matter what we call it? So whether we believe there's only one God or only, so what's the difference between one God and one high God and a bunch of minor gods, and one God and a bunch of angels? Other than definition, right? So we're much more comfortable with that, but is it fundamentally different, or is it just about our labels?
Yeah. I think it's, from my perspective, the labels for sure. Yeah. It makes it very difficult for somebody to go, oh yeah, there are many gods mentioned in the Bible, or there are many gods that they believed in. It's more comfortable to go, they're angels.
Yeah.
So
much, yeah. Because again, that's about coherence. We want the system that makes sense, and we explain it in a way that makes sense to us. Everybody wants to believe that their tradition is the right one, and this is the logical kind of conclusion of the argument. They're angels, we're better than you. Their gods are demons who are fallen angels. So our system encompasses the entire world, and we're right.
Right. Well,
is that true? I don't know, but it is comforting.
Right. Yeah. Well, Dr. Hundley, this has been fun. I appreciate your time trying to journey in through their mindset and trying to see what they saw and believed what they believe. But I very much appreciate your time. Do you have anything that you're working on? If you want to talk about your books, I'm going to link some of your books in the comments and in the descriptions of YouTube and all that. So
sure. So I did just have with Ancient Near East today. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I just had a 4-part series that's more public facing. So what is a God in the Ancient Near East? And then 2 parts, what is a God in the Hebrew Bible? And then the 4th one is, from monolatry to monotheism. So pretty much what we're talking about. And that is written for people who are not academics and scholars. So I think that is a good entry point into what I'm arguing. Also with that too is, like, again, as scholars, we take the data we have and make the best cases that we're able to. We're not really proving things. People often make the assumption, hey, or scholars do this too. We tend to present ourselves as the answer.
Yeah.
But really, we're just doing guesswork like everybody else. We're taking the data we have and making the best cases we have.
Sure.
So this is an ongoing process. It's a dialogue. I'm not here to tell you the way things are. I've studied it more, which means I might have some more answers, but doesn't mean I'm right. So what I am trying to finish up right now, I just have the intro and conclusion to write. It's a book called Ancient Gods and Monsters. And I think that's a really interesting one in my mind too, because, well, virtually every culture throughout the history of the world has had them. Gods and monsters, heroes and villains, and the line between them is often really fuzzy. So if you compare objectively gods and monsters, they're almost identical. They have a lot of the same characteristics. And more often than not, the way we do it, it's a matter of our perspective, how we tend to use these terms.
Right.
So it looks at the ancient world as how they constructed their worldviews. Who are the gods? Who are the monsters? What does that say about them? And I think it really does actually land in today's world, where we're always constructing heroes and monsters based on our own social locations and whatnot. So this idea where those guys out there are bad and they're monstrous, and then the guy on my side is a hero or a god, it is a natural way for us how we construct our world, and we've done it since the very beginning. So what I'm doing is looking at the stories and looking at the ways they've done that, and hoping to see how it is relevant today.
Right. Awesome. Well, I'm going to have those links. When does that book come out?
I do not know. It takes a while.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Or the editing process. So I am almost done writing it. I would guess probably another year-ish.
Right. Okay.
Well,
we'll keep a lookout on that. I'm going to link up your other materials in the YouTube description and the Apple podcast. But again, this has been great. Dr. Hundley, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate you sharing some of it with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.